Now that I've cut all of the tapers, I want to just talk a little bit about cleaning up the surfaces of the legs. I have hand planed the tapers. Now I want to hand plane the outside surface of the legs. Let's do that first. Again, paying attention to the grain orientation. Back the plane off. Again, all we're doing is we're just smoothing the surface. There we go. And then this surface as well. One thing that I want to talk about is right here where the tenon goes in. If I plane this too much, or even plane it out of square, I could really mess up the shoulders and we could have a gap. There's a couple ways to deal with it. You can plane this as long as you're very careful to keep the plane perfectly flat and you're not taking off too much material. You see how I did that? I kept it very flat and worked it over the top. If you're uncomfortable with this, you could actually use the scraper, holding it at an angle and pressing lightly and just scraping it along and just smooth that up. However, you can actually indent this with the scraper as well. You could use a piece of sandpaper wrapped around a block. Either way, whatever method you use, you just have to make sure that you don't change the shape of this area. I prefer to use a plane as long as it's set very lightly. Keeping the plane very flat, work it along that surface. The next thing that I want to do to this leg is I want to break the edges. You can use the number 4.5 for this, although it can be a little bit cumbersome in your hand, and you want to break all the edges. What I like to use for breaking the edges is a block plane. The block plane is nice because it fits nicely in your hand, and you can just run it along all of the edges. There's no need to worry here. We're just going to break all the edges. There's a little bit of a reveal right there, so we can break this edge and all these edges. This sure beats using sandpaper to break the edge, and the more you use sandpaper, the more you introduce dust. I will use some sandpaper to bring a uniform texture to all of the surfaces prior to gluing up or even finishing. You can choose to sand it after you glue it up if you want. Sometimes it's easier though to sand it before you glue it up. I'm going to use 220 grit sandpaper to just lightly go over the surfaces. One last thing that I'm going to do with the block plane is I'm going to chamfer the bottom of each of these legs. The reason for that is if you have the table on a hard surface, say on a tile floor or even a wood floor, and it catches something on the floor, you don't want it to break a piece of wood off of the bottom of the leg. So if you just simply chamfer around the edge, that'll preempt any breakage that could happen on the bottom of the leg. We'll just come over here using the exact same technique that we learned in making the box. Shearing cut, slicing it along. Don't be afraid to put a heavy chamfer on here as well. I like a heavy chamfer. It gives the table a little lift, if you will, off of the floor, giving it a nice, elegant look. Of course, most people aren't going to be getting on their hands and knees and inspecting your table that close, but for those that do, they'll be pleasantly surprised. There we have it. We've got a nice little chamfer all around the edge there, and we've preempted any breakage that could happen if it was to be slid across the floor. I'm going to do the same exact process on the remainder 3 legs. I've just finished planing and scraping all the surfaces of the legs. Some of the surfaces I was able to plane. This leg I actually had to scrape, and you can clearly see why. There's some grain that's curved like this, so you plane only so far and it starts tearing out. That's where the scraper comes in. Now I'm just going to take a little bit of sandpaper wrapped around a block. This is 220 grit sandpaper, and I'm just going to lightly sand the surfaces. This brings a uniform scratch pattern to all of the surfaces. We'll do this prior to gluing up. We'll do it on all the surfaces of the legs. We'll also do this on the outside surface of the aprons. We're now ready to glue up.